Welcome back to Latin America Review. Today we have a special program that's been of a lot of interest to our audience. Joining us from Panama City, the capital of Panama, is Richard Morales. Richard is a professor, a political economist, and he was a candidate for the left-wing party's primary in the last elections. He's here to speak to us about what's been going on with the protests around the country that have been going on for the last few weeks and really popped off around the start of July. Richard, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, Camilla, for the invitation. It's an honor.
So give us a little bit of a background or a sum up of what's going on right now. My understanding is that the protests really intensified around July 1st, but I've been following things in Panama and some of the comrades on the ground. It really seems like it's been a few months that they've been making demands and coming out to the streets. Tell us what's going on there.
Well, the more intense protests, which include roadblocks in different parts of the country, mostly in the interior, but also a series of marches and more isolated roadblocks as well near the capital city, have been going on for the last few weeks. But before that, there was a strong protest movement. The social movements coalesced in a bloc called the People's United for Life, El Pueblo Unido, Alianza El Pueblo Unido por la Vida, which made a series of demands on the government concerning living standards. Living standards have been deteriorating in Panama for the last few years. It is not only because of COVID-19, but it has to do with the political, the economic model that we have in Panama and the way our economy is organized. And so these demands involve pay raises. They involve controlling the prices for different for foodstuff, for fuel, for energy. Panama is a country where most of the products or the main products that people need to live, from food, housing, medicine, are controlled by a few oligopolies. These are few capitalists that have concentrated large amounts of power, and that through the complicity of the state have been able to control the supply of these products in the country. So these are demands that were made again towards the state, but also mainly against these capitalists, which are basically control Panamanian living standards and speculate with their prices. While these demands were being made in a fairly periodic and in constant fashion, in different parts of the country, due to the rising cost of fuel, different protests began by los transportistas, but also by which are the transport workers, but also agricultural workers. So during the time that the social movements were making demands on the government, were organizing mass protests in the city, these different roadblocks began to be implemented in the interior of the country. Panama is a country where basically most of the population is concentrated between Panama City and Colón City, which are the two terminal cities of the Panama Canal. So most of the economy revolves around these two cities, which are once again on one is in the Atlantic coast and one is in the Pacific coast. Panama in the Pacific, Colón in the Atlantic. So usually here is where most of the economic and political life takes place. But there is a huge part of the country which is mostly marginalized, which there's very little government investment in it, and which is mostly concentrated in agricultural activities, which would be the interior of the country. And the more intense protests began in the interior, in the provinces of Veraguas, which is more or less in the middle of the country, and Chiriquí, which is in the frontier with Costa Rica. And so the transport workers, the agricultural workers began organizing protests, but things really intensified when the teachers came out onto the streets, and the teachers started to make a series of demands which were coherent or similar to the ones that the social movements in in Panama City had been making. And these demands mostly involved had to do with the rising cost of life, with the prices of food, with the prices of medicines, and with the prices of fuel. And so these protests basically cut off the inter-American highway, and this is the highway that connects all of the Americas. So it's the main highway for transportation of goods between countries from Central America to Panama, and when Panama through to the ports and to the rest of South America. So basically, they started blocking the highway as a means of protest, and also the indigenous peoples. In Panama, we have 7 indigenous peoples, and they have control over autonomous lands, comarcas, which are under forms of self-government. And the and they also started protesting and putting up roadblocks in different parts of the Inter-American highway. So most of the country began to be paralyzed, and similar actions started to spring up in other parts of the country. In the east of Panama City, near El Darien. Darien is in the frontier with Colombia. It's mostly a jungle area, but in the more urbanized parts, before you get to the jungle parts, there will also strong protests. These are also areas that are strongly marginalized, that don't receive much or any of the wealth that is produced in the terminal cities or the metropolitan area around the Panama Canal. So you had very strong protest in mostly the interior parts of the country, the more marginalized parts of the country, with the indigenous peoples also making a very powerful stand. And in the capital city, the social movements, which had been organizing for some time before the protest, also started to intensify the pressure on the government, so that means of solutions could be implemented to alleviate the difficult condition that most Panamanians were suffering at the time.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting case and example for the rest of the region to look at, because for so long we have a lot of friends and colleagues from the Caribbean, English speaking people, as well as from other parts of Latin America. And there's the Copa hub there in Panama, and everybody travels there. Everybody loves Panama because you can do tons of shopping. And it just has all this like American stuff, and it's more accessible for us who live in Latin America, the Caribbean. And, it's just really set up for tourism. And I think that, people only see one side of it. And of course, you're a political economist, but there is a lot of there has been economic growth, but it doesn't seem to have reached the people, the Panamanian people. It's quite absurd, actually. And so talk a little bit about that. I mean, this is a country where we have tons of business people. There's probably a lot of foreigners, people who speak English, who are there for those purposes, for their businesses and whatnot. But it's like two different worlds. It's a world that the resources and the benefits of those resources and that economic prosperity doesn't actually trickle down to anyone there.
Yeah, well, it's important to understand how Panama's economy works, and also to point out that it is usually ranked as the second most unequal country in Latin America, behind either Colombia or Brazil, depending on what year the measurements are taken. But it is usually the second most unequal country within the most unequal region in the world. So this is a highly unequal country where wealth is highly concentrated and where poverty is widespread. But if one remains near that the Copa hub, the airport hub, or in certain parts of the city, where you have a skyline. I'll explain why we have a skyline of skyscrapers and office buildings, very reminiscent of more developed cities. One would assume that it is a prosperous country. This is a country that for a few years between 2011 2013 had growth rates similar to China's, above 10%. So this is a country which has high growth, high inequality, and that has to do a lot with the way its economy is structured. Of course, it's a capitalist economy. It implemented neoliberal reforms in the end of the 70s, and it has been deepening these neoliberal reforms all the way from then. But what is particular about Panama is that it has a different economic structure than most of the other countries in Latin America. Most Latin American countries are concentrated on on rent extraction from the exportation of some commodity, whether it be a food commodity, whether it be a natural resource like oil, like gas, like minerals. So most of the Latin American economies have this, they are structured around the exportation of commodities. But Panama's is mostly based on the exploitation of its geographic position, given the Panama Canal. This has been going on for more than 500 years. When the Spanish first came to Panama and they established a route to transport the gold and the silver that they were stealing from South America and from from Peru, and they would move it through Panama to the Atlantic coast and towards Europe. So this country has for more than 500 years revolved around the transportation of goods and people from one coast, from the Pacific to the Atlantic to the Pacific. Nowadays, that takes the form of the Panama Canal and the logistics system. But this transport system, which involves the canal, the ports, the railway system, is in the hands basically of part of it is controlled by the state, but that the control of the state company, the ACP, is in the hands of oligarchs basically, and most of the logistics system is in the hands of either transnational capitalists in association with some of the wealthier or more powerful capitalists in Panama. And so that gives one an idea of how this economy revolves. What it sells to the world is not a commodity like most of Latin America. What it sells to the world is its geographic position and the ability to transport goods at a faster rate and reduce capital's rotation basically. But it has also built an economy, a service economy, a commercial and service economy around the logistics system, around the canal. So many people have heard about the Panama Papers and how Panama has basically articulated the basically anonymous societies or these accounts where you can open up a company in Panama and it's a Panamanian company, but as long as it's not operating in Panama, you don't have to pay taxes. So it can be a company that's operating in any other country, but be in our territory and not have to pay taxes in Panama. So many people have many companies around the world buy these legal services in Panama. And in the 70s, Panama opened up an international offshore banking center. So not only can they open up companies here, they can move their money here in dollars because Panama is a dollarized economy. So Panama has also specialized in these offshore legal and banking services, which take advantage of its geographic position and also commerce. It's opened up a series of economic commercial hubs where people can move merchandise without having to pay taxes or any sort of duties. So basically, Panama has this economy that revolves around transport, around commercial, legal, and financial services, which does not generate many jobs, where wealth is highly concentrated in the people that are the owners of these businesses, where it's a country that has left to one side or has not tried to develop industry or agriculture or any other type of or implemented any other type of developmental strategy which would be more beneficial towards the people and towards the country. So that basically gives us a structure of the Panamanian economy. There's basically this enclave that sells transport services, legal services, financial services that helps move merchandise from one point to another. But that's basically disconnected from the rest of the economy, from most of the people. Most of the people in Panama have informal jobs where it's basically just, survival type jobs where you try and sell knickknacks or open up improvised businesses. So it's a highly informal economy. More than 50% of the economically active population is in informal activity, and that number isn't even taken into account rural workers who usually aren't even included in the statistics. So that's an idea of how this economy works and who manages to appropriate the rent that is generated from controlling these activities. But it's also important to take into account that this has been a country historically dominated by the United States, that from the middle of the 19th century, when the United States built the Panama Canal Railway, they have been militarily intervening in Panama. The United States has intervened directly with Marines more than 20 times from middle of the 19th century to our times. In 1989, it had the most vicious of those interventions, which was when they invaded the country with a death count that is still unknown. There has been an unwillingness to actually find the truth about the number of deaths that occurred during that invasion, where they tested highly specialized weaponry and burned down El Chorrillo, which was the neighborhood where, or the part of the country where the Panamanian military had its base in, basically got burned to the ground. So this is a country that was invaded ending the 80s, beginning the 90s, and basically the United States has geopolitically continued to exercise a strong amount of pressure within our country. Like that sort of basically helps paint a picture of what Panama is. Formally, the United States does not have presence in Panama at the moment. In 1999, the Torrijos-Carter Accords were finalized, and those basically established that the United States had to leave Panamanian territory, including the military bases that they had in our territory. But they left a neutrality clause that if in any way the transport through the Panama Canal was interrupted or in danger, they could intervene to reestablish the transport service.
Yeah, I think the response to those numerous marine invasions and U.S. interventions is what has really formed kind of, ideologically perhaps push some of the social movements and unions there to the left. And I don't think that it's well known that that people have been so mobilized there on different occasions, and that there is sort of this I think significant leftist movement there, anti-imperialist movement, in response to all those different incidents that have happened with the U.S. And we have seen, as we said, there have been these protests organized in the city in Panama before this current uprising that's happening around the country, in response to the visits of officials from the United States. We've seen, obviously, there was a very big protest and pushback against the visit of Anthony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, but there was also representation from the White House and Southcom on other occasions in a very short period of time in what is supposed to be one of the official democracies of our region. Talk a little bit about how this is a country that has such close ties. As you explained, officially there's no U.S. military presence as there was before, but they continue to work, this government currently continues to work hand in hand with the United States in many ways.
Yeah, it's important to note that Panama has historically had a very strong anti-imperialist movement. It is that powerful anti-imperialist movement that reached, we could say, that managed to force Panamanian-U.S. relations in the 60s to a breaking point, where the U.S. was forced to recognize, after mass protests from Panamanians towards the Panama Canal Zone, which was the area around the canal that the United States controlled. Those mass protests forced the U.S. government to recognize that their presence in Panama was unsustainable and that they had to leave the country, or those protests would only continue to get worse. So that is it is, that strong anti-imperialist movement and the pressure of the Panamanian people that forced the United States to sit down to negotiate an accord with the Panamanians for them to leave Panama, and that includes leaving behind Southcom, which was used to be established in Panama. It also meant the School of the Americas closing down, which is where most of the right-wing military dictators in Latin America were trained. So it was a strong anti-imperialist victory to force the United States and their military bases, more than 14 bases, out of the country. But yeah, like you established, they invaded in 1989, and that allowed them to reestablish a different type of relationship. They knew the canal was going to revert to Panama in 1999, so basically they made sure that the governments in Panama would be governments which were servile to the United States, which would respond to their whims. And they signed a series of security accords that allowed the United States partial presence in Panama, even if not formal. The United States can use Panamanian infrastructure to move their troops. They can remain here formally, even though they do, but they can use it to move around the airports, terminals, ports. So it is a common occurrence to see some sort of United States military plane or boat in Panama. Um, and these recent visits, moving forward in time now to our times, these recent visits of high-ranking government and defense officials is related in a certain way to a desire to not allow Panama to establish deeper relationships with China. Panama established diplomatic relations with China in 2017, so it's very recently. And there was a series of infrastructure projects which were going to be developed, but the United States and the new government basically blocked all of those projects. So they basically froze our relationships, or at least the different cooperation projects that we had with that we were developing with China. It's ironic that the government that actually established those relationships was right wing, even though all Panamanian governments are basically right wing. And recently, the United States has been trying to strengthen their presence in the country. Once again, it does so informally. It basically establishes deeper cooperation with Panama security forces. It tried before to establish, for example, in the 90s, a sort of anti-narcotics regional base here. There was mass protests that forced them to abandon those plans. They recently have tried to build something similar using the war on drugs as an excuse. And now that a great part of Latin America is under progressive governments, including Colombia, it seems the United States is trying to strengthen its presence in Panama as a way to compensate for its loss of presence in Colombia, in Brazil, in South America in general, in Mexico. It appears to be seeing Panama as one of its bastions, where it can maintain a strong presence here. And it's also always geopolitically vital. There is the Panama Canal that is part of it is part of the United States regional control to maintain that strong control over the canal and the logistics system. So one could see that these recent visits are related to what is happening in the region, to the victories of left-leaning or left-wing or progressive governments in different countries. And the current government has been completely submissive to all of their whims.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that within the context of everything that has happened with COVID, with the conflict overseas, and with all of these elections and, future elections of leftist governments, and also, the fact that the Caribbean countries are all coming together to demand the lifting of oil sanctions on Venezuela. People are going off and signing agreements and joining. Most countries have now joined on to the Belt and Road Initiative in Latin America and the Caribbean, that the U.S. is clenching tighter to its close allies. We've seen that in Colombia, where it seems like Ivan Duque was going like every week to the U.S. for another event in his final months here in the presidency. And that, like we said, these official delegations have been sent very regularly to Panama. So that really seems to be the case, that when they're not able to maneuver geopolitically the way they had before, or exert that sort of influence and dominance as before, that they, are kind of doing even more harm to those that they do have control of. And Panama is definitely one of them. Do you happen to know what some of those agreements or what direction they were going in with those China agreements that you mentioned?
Yeah, there was Panama had many infrastructure investment projects that were part of the Belt and Road. The main one was a rail line, a railway that was going to a high-speed rail that was going to connect the country from frontier to frontier, from the Colombian border or the Darien border, because there is the Darien um, jungle. But it was basically going to connect the entire country from one frontier to the other, and that would allow Panama to be connected by rail to the rest of Central America. The idea would be to be connected through infrastructure, and that could allow more cooperation and commerce between our countries, because most of Latin American countries are outward looking. Their main markets are the United States or Europe or some other country. But the idea is which is part of the progressive agenda of Latin America, to strengthen regional integration. The idea that we should form a strong economic and political bloc that has the power to counter United States pressure or European pressure. So basically, what was blocked under this government was that infrastructure project, the railway, but also a bridge project that was the fourth bridge over the Panama Canal, which was also the project that was going to connect the metro line. Panama under the last administrations have been developing a subterranean metro system, and the idea was going to be to connect that metro system to the west part of the country, which is the one after the Panama Canal on the other side of the canal. So it was a series of transport infrastructures mainly, and the port that there were the different investments that China was interested in making in Panama, which once again is part of the Belt and Road Initiative. But most of these projects have been paralyzed, frozen. Some were taken away from the companies who had already won the bids. And the United States has also tried to implement or has brought to Panama the equivalent of the Belt and Road Initiative. It began under Trump. America Grows, I think, is the translation of the Spanish name. America Crece, America, something of the sort. Biden has an equivalent to this. But it's curious that a lot of the Panamanian elite or bourgeoisie were actually on board with with strengthening ties with China, mostly because it made economic sense for the country to diversify who they were trading in, who they were cooperating with. The United States stopped being as a partner. The relationship has been mostly one-sided. We signed the free trade agreement more than 10 years ago, which is threatening to destroy the Panamanian agricultural production. So there are attempts by the Panamanian government to renegotiate that agreement before it's too late, before our agricultural capacity is completely destroyed. So those would be some of those projects that were being negotiated with the Chinese government that have been frozen under the current government. This history of U.S. Let's say pressure over the governments. And once again, isn't new, but there have actually been some recent episodes of this. For the 2009 elections, for example, the two candidates which came together, Martinelli and Varela. Martinelli was actually tried in the United States and extradited to Panama for using the U.S. financial system for money laundering. And his sons have been condemned in the United States and are going to do jail time in New York. So President Martinelli and ex-President Martinelli and ex-President Varela came together in 2009 in the U.S. Embassy, and it is there that they agreed to form a political alliance to defeat the candidate of one of the opposition parties. So the U.S. has actually even been influencing who are the candidates, what sort of agreements they agree to. But the most visible way of U.S. interference in Panama is through military cooperation. The U.S. does not have a formal military. After the U.S. invasion in 1989, a prohibition was established in the Constitution so that we couldn't have a military. But we have a military in anything but name that is basically trained by the United States, and they continue to increase their presence here mainly through different security agreements and joint. But that is the way it is presented as joint and military cooperation.
Yeah, and they're presenting, the reasons or justifying the this sort of cooperation as being about, promotion of democracy and human rights in the region, like saying Panama and the United States can partner together to help democracy happen elsewhere, that sort of a thing. And then, because Panama is a good country, so supposedly in the eyes of Washington, so they're, so they're getting together to sort of to strengthen that alliance. But they're also talking about, migration and climate change and using these different things. It's always something new. There's always like security cooperation on the basis of fighting drug trafficking, the war on drugs, whatever it is that they come up with at the time. But really what's happening is that the US is truly it's exporting its model to Panama in the worst of ways. As you mentioned, the United States right now, amid this conflict, is having its supply chain issues. And, that's what's happening in its friendly countries as well. There's an attack on its agricultural sector. And, we have countries that the campesinos can't even afford some of the things that they play an important hand in producing. But if you could tell us a little bit about what some of the views of regular Panamanians are regarding, some of the different things going on in the world, just broadly, because, for example, you mentioned integration. I think, there's just this kind of view sometimes that, people who live under right-wing regimes, maybe they're right-wing as well. That's why they elected a right-wing country. How do you think the regular Panamanians feel about the project of, for example, ALBA TCP, about having stronger alliances with other countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, and stronger trade in the region, and not having to correspond with the United States for every single interaction and thing that goes on? And how do you think they feel about, for example, those agreements and that potential to grow with China and Russia and other international and global powers?
I think we are at a breaking point in Panama where there is a shift or a change in the general consciousness in the country. For a long time, let's say from the 80s onward, there was this idea that the U.S. was Panama's friend, Panama's ally, which is a bit ironic given the history. The U.S. intervenes in '89. The formal excuse is to remove Noriega, and the ironic thing is that Noriega had been and it is a recognized fact. It's not some sort of conspiracy theory. He was a CIA operative. He was an intelligence officer trained by the United States, who becomes military dictator of Panama. For a variety of reasons, the relations begin to deteriorate. Noriega also loses control over the country. Social tension begins to arrive. So he becomes an uncomfortable ally. The U.S. invades, removes him, and assures that the civilian governments which follow are ones whom the United States could control to a reasonable degree, and who could also maintain control over the country, which Noriega could no longer do. So he became a useless ally, or a nuisance, if one wants to put it that way. But in the eyes of many Panamanians during those early years, this was seen as a liberatory action. The idea that the U.S. came in and liberated Panama from this dictator, even though it is the U.S. who put the dictator there in the first place and who kept him in power in a certain degree. Up to few years before that, the Panamanian military under Noriega and the U.S. military had very tight cooperation, very similar to the ones we have nowadays. So those first few years after the invasion, that view of the invasion as a sort of liberatory action or political intervention sort of predominated, even though the social movements from the very first moment were protesting, were condemning the invasion, took it to presented a series of measures in international forums in the Inter-American Court. So it is the idea that this was generally viewed and constructed through the media as a sort of liberatory action did not imply that the anti-imperialist popular movements were not there rejecting what had happened. But over the years, it has been clear to the people, and there's been a lot of work being done on this in academia, in the communities, in alternative theater, cinema, that of where the truth of what the invasion was, what the United States has been to Panama, where this has slowly become something that most people recognize, that we were wronged as a country, that there was a criminal war waged upon a weak and small country to subdue it under for geopolitical reasons. But that is in terms of the relationship to the U.S. In terms of, let's say, the relationship to general social change, Panama has the curiosity that during the peak of what some call the peak tide, or when progressive governments were in power during the years of Chavez, Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, Lula, Pepe Mujica. During those years, Panama had right-wing governments. It's equivalent of some sort of similar to Colombia in a certain way, which during that time had Uribe. Panama had Martinelli. So we didn't have a left-wing government, and we've never had a left-wing government actually in Panama. But there could be a reason why in Panama that there wasn't at that time a strong political movement, because socially the social movements were on the ground fighting the government, fighting over social security reform, labor reform, and over different laws that were trying to be enacted against workers in the country. But politically, we weren't competing for power like in other countries in the region. One factor in that was that when the Panama Canal and the territories around the canal reverted to Panama, Panama had basically a massive injection of billions of dollars worth of wealth, or activos in Spanish. Where basically we received not only the canal and control over the canal, but also the port system, were also very valuable land and other assets. Assets was the word I was looking for. Assets in that year. So in a certain way, the country started to grow exponentially, and that's what partially explains those very high growth rates of 9-10% for a few years, because we have this massive injection of assets and wealth from the reversal of assets that were under the control of the United States. So during the peak years of leftist governments in the region, of discontent with neoliberal reforms that were done in these countries in the 80s and 90s, Panama was that tendency was somehow being counteracted in Panama through this injection of wealth, assets from the canal, which we had just received. But that sort of short-lived prosperity has now run out, and towards the end of the last decade, before this one, 2018-19, the Panamanian economy had begun to slow down. It basically started to stall. What had been the levers of the Panamanian economy, which is basically using its financial and legal services to attract money from abroad, then to move that money or reinvest it in real estate. So real estate speculation plays a heavy role, but not in the way it played a role in the United States through through the financial system, but mostly by attracting money from abroad that saw in Panama sort of a safe haven to keep their assets in dollars in a country which was considered relatively stable. So that's what and that sort of economy pushed the construction sector. So Panama managed to create jobs for a very long time, basically by speculating with land and building skyscrapers, office buildings, commercial centers, even though nobody was occupying a lot of them, but money was being invested into them, and they were being bought and resold at higher prices. Also, we had very lax tax incentives, so no taxes were being placed on whoever bought these properties. That has started to come to an end. That sort of machinery, the money started to ease up from abroad. There's also a reason why the U.S. and Europe have also started pressuring Panama. That explains the Panama Papers in a certain way, because they wanted to avoid their own companies and citizens using Panama to move money and avoid taxes within their countries. So that started also to pressure more the financial and legal system in Panama, and sort of put an end to that model, that growth model that Panama had, very unequal growth model, but that had managed to move the economy forward, though precariously. So by 2018, 2019, it was clear that Panama was moving towards an economic crisis. There was very high unemployment, very high informality, rising prices before COVID. COVID hit, this just gets worse. And now we have the high food, fuel, and medicine prices. And that all just became a time bomb, basically an economic model that ran out of steam, that could maintain, let's say it managed to keep moving for some time, since we had just received that massive wealth and asset injection from the canal, and from the land that was under US control. But that all started to run out. So now people are more critical of the economic model that we have, much more critical of elites. There's a negotiating table right now between the government and the social movements. The social movements are denouncing the economic model. They're not only asking for reduced prices for food, for medicines, for fuel, for energy, they're also denouncing the fact that all these sectors are under the control of powerful oligopolies protected by the governments. And these oligopolies basically can't speculate with prices under this protection by the state. And these are the same capitalists that control the state in Panama, that finance all political campaigns, and that has allowed them to basically accumulate this wealth in a very indiscriminate fashion. There's growing consciousness of this, and it is being recognized that the ones who are making the demands are actors of the social movements who have also participated politically in the past. So we could say that we are in a crucial conjuncture in Panama, where a change of consciousness is taking place, and where people are more clear about what the causes of this are.
I wonder, how this will result. Like you said, there have been some efforts to negotiate between those social sectors and the government, and we saw this huge wave of 18 days of quite militant protests led by the CONAIE in Ecuador. And, that all came to an end when, the CONAIE indigenous movement leaders sat down with the government, as well as, I think, some representation from some of the other sectors that were involved in those protests, and they came to an agreement, which they say they will evaluate. But the government did have to make some concessions. I guess, what do you think? Where is Panama heading in terms of any dialogue with the government, and what do these movements hope to realistically achieve? I think obviously that what they need and what the outcome needs to be is, like they said, those price freezes on those basic necessities, and no more like out of control inflation, especially at a time like this. They would obviously hope to have a situation more like what we have economically here in Bolivia, where things have relatively stayed the exact same price as before because of the government action. What do you think the end goal here is, or what's going to happen?
Well, the huge challenge is that the government that we have in Panama does not respond to the needs of the people. So any conquest that we manage are going to be that will be in the hands of this anti-popular government of the PRD, which is the party in power. But there have been significant conquests in the negotiating table. So there are two big blocks of organizations which are currently protesting. One is La Alianza Pueblo Unido por la Vida, the People United for Life Alliance, and the other is the ANADEPO, la Alianza Nacional por los Derechos del Pueblo Organizado, so the Alliance for the Rights of the Organized Peoples. And these are made up of workers from construction, from different industries in Panama, from agricultural workers to teachers. The teachers have played a very valiant role in these protests. There's also a block of indigenous peoples who are sitting on the table, and also some social leaders from different parts of the country. But these are the main blocks who are currently negotiating, and they managed to force the government to open one negotiating table. The government wanted to have multiple tables to divide the movement. So they managed to make the government sit down, its ministers, on one table, and to have that table be televised. So the table is currently, and the negotiations are being televised and on the public broadcasting network. So that allows the people to see what the social movements are saying in that table, and that has allowed that has helped that consciousness creating process, to the point that the business sector and the business associations have been pressuring as of late to get in, to be in the table, because they aren't a part of it. But the social movement have managed to keep the business sector out of the negotiations. What have they managed so far? They have managed to negotiate a subsidized or reduced price for fuel, for gasoline and diesel. It's a price of $3.25 per gallon. And they have also managed to reduce and freeze the price of many foodstuffs through a combination of means, either direct subsidies or regulation of profit margins or peak prices for different products. More than 70 products have been placed under this scheme. So the series of demands that are going to be negotiating involves a series of other issues, including medicines, including energy, corruption, investment in education. But these initial conquests have been achieved. But even though we have managed this reduced price for gasoline, even though we have managed to these to get the government to agree to price controls, the complaint or the battle still being fought is that we need more long-term solutions. For example, in fuel, even though the price of gasoline is determined by factors which the Panamanian government evidently doesn't control, there is a margin of control within the country in terms of the companies that are in charge of basically importing and commercializing and distributing fuel in Panama. And so we are fighting for the regulation of that supply chain, basically the profit margins, the cost that they have in that chain, because we know that can help move us towards a sustainable solution in the long term. That Panama could have more control over or that supply chain of fuel. But that the same goes for food. We know that there are powerful commercial interests, commercial bourgeois importers who basically speculate with food prices in the country in detriment of consumers, but also small and medium-sized agricultural producers. So there is an attempt to transform those supply chains, to take the power away from those companies, because price controls aren't going to be a long-term solution if those companies still maintain control over those supply chains. Same goes for medicine. We know that we can agree to lower prices for medicine, and the government can subsidize lower prices. But if we don't do something about the capitals that control those importation and commercialization chains, in the long term, we know that those prices are going to go back up, especially once the pressure subsides from the social movements. But while the sides are negotiating, the protests have remained. Some have subsided as a way as a show of good faith from the social movements. But the protest and the pressure has maintained itself, because we know that once the people come out of the street, the government won't be as pressured to continue negotiating. So the roadblocks and the pressure has continued in different parts of the country.
Yeah, it's fascinating that those roadblocks, that's very impressive. That's a huge artery, a huge roadway, and it definitely has the potential to stop a lot of economic activity. And it seems to have, at least at some points during this period, have been held quite militantly. I have one last question, I guess, just to wrap things up, and that's social movements and unions have been quite, from what I can tell, in different periods, quite well articulated, and have a very strong anti-imperialist disposition. And so what lies ahead electorally in terms of what sort of route these movements and these bases want to take in order to finally install, a popular government potentially, or at least some sort of leftist government. What do you think is going to happen in this coming period?
I would say it's going to be difficult for the left-wing parties or the social movements in Panama to participate in a way that allows them to dispute the government in the coming elections. There will be participation in local elections, legislative elections, but we have our national elections are coming up in 2024, and the electoral periods are so close that there probably won't be time to politically prepare the left wing parties for that election. But the change in the correlation of forces in the country, the growing consciousness, does tell us that in the elections after that 2029, things could be very different. So what I would expect is that this next election will demonstrate that there is there is a rejection of traditional parties, of traditional party interest, in the sense that they are representatives of the dominant class. We'll probably have an election where what predominates is this sort of weak anti-corruption, right wing parties or candidates sort of taking an even more protagonical role. I would say that tends to be the type of governments and candidates that predominate before people fully recognize it's not enough to have this anti-corruption stance, because corruption isn't the root problem. It's the model that generates that corruption in the first place, the system that builds it. So I would expect there to be significant pushback against the traditional candidates and parties in this election. I would expect there to be some important victories in local or legislative elections. Once again, we don't have left-wing presence in our assembly either. The left-wing parties have not managed, or we have not managed to achieve positions of power or decision-making power within within any of the state powers. That has to do with the reasons I expressed earlier. But it seems that we are at a breakaway point, and everything points that this election will demonstrate that the Panamanian people have recognized that we have to change the political and economic model, the recognition that other countries in the region achieved that allowed the popular governments to reach power in the first place, and that could consolidate in 2029. It's very difficult to anticipate what will happen between then and now. Once again, the factor of U.S. presence cannot be underestimated in Panama. They have this neutrality accord with the country, which they can use as an excuse to intervene. They have been ramping up their presence here. So while the social movements are strengthening, they could be anticipating that and also planning to heighten their presence there. So the social movements also have to be on the lookout for that increased U.S. pressure here, which could be used to try and block any sort of ascent of the left to power.
Well, here's to hoping. I'm still optimistic, at least for 2029, but I'm very happy to see the social movements and their representatives of unions and those anti-imperialist sectors all around the continent, which I've had the privilege of being able to bump into them and hear from them in this past year. Thank you so much, Richard, for joining us. It was a very good sum up of the current protests and what have led up to it. We've been speaking to professor and political economist Richard Morales, based in Panama. Thank you so much, and we are happy to hear from you anytime, and even happier to hopefully see you soon in Panama.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It was a pleasure to speak to you.